There is a stretch of ground along Sibley Avenue in Canton, Illinois, where the weeds come up differently than they do in the surrounding fields. Thicker, darker at the root. The kind of growth that comes from soil that has absorbed decades of machine oil and iron filings, and the particular sweat of men who worked in 3 shifts, 6 days a week, through every harvest season that America can remember since the Second World War. The Canton Works of International Harvester, Plant 34 in the company's own internal numbering, produced its last tractor in 1984. The buildings are mostly gone now. Fulton County, which once counted the Canton plant among the largest employers between Peoria and the Iowa state line, has been losing population in almost every census since 1980. The color that came off that line was Farmall red. Not red like a fire engine, not red like a barn. Farmall red, a specific, deliberate, arterial declaration of identity that turned every field it entered into a statement about who farmed it and what they believed about farming. They don't make that red in Canton anymore. They don't make anything in Canton anymore.
To understand what Canton meant, you have to go back further than Canton. You have to go back to Chicago, 1831, and a young Virginian named Cyrus Hall McCormick, who had spent the previous year watching his father fail to build a mechanical reaper that actually worked. Cyrus was 22 years old. The family farm in Rockbridge County, Virginia, had a problem that every grain farmer in America shared. You could only harvest wheat as fast as a man with a scythe could swing it. A field that took a week to cut by hand represented a week's worth of weather risk, a week's worth of grain that might stand too long and shatter before you got to it. The bottleneck wasn't growing wheat, the bottleneck was cutting it. In 1831, on a hillside in Virginia, Cyrus McCormick demonstrated a mechanical reaper that cut 6 acres of oats in an hour later. It was not beautiful. The Virginia Gazette called it a right smart of a curious machine, but it worked. And in 1847, McCormick moved his operation to Chicago, closer to the expanding grain belt, closer to the railroads, closer to the farmers who needed what he was making. He built a factory on the north branch of the Chicago River, and he began shipping reapers west.
The McCormick Harvesting Machine Company became, by the 1870s, the largest agricultural implement manufacturer in the world. But McCormick was not alone in that ambition. Across the prairie, 3 other companies were making similar calculations: Deering Harvester Company, Plano Manufacturing, Milwaukee Harvester. By 1900, the implement business had become a brutal contest of price cutting, patent litigation, and dealer network war that was consuming companies faster than the frontier was producing farms. In 1902, J.P. Morgan, the same Morgan who had assembled U.S. Steel the previous year, brokered the consolidation that created International Harvester. 5 companies merged: McCormick, Deering, Plano, Milwaukee, and Champion. The new corporation controlled roughly 85% of the American grain harvester market and had manufacturing operations spread across Illinois, Wisconsin, and Indiana. The federal government sued them for monopoly within the decade, but by then, International Harvester was already too deeply embedded in the American farm economy to uproot.
The color in those early years was not yet Farmall red. The original McCormick machines had been painted in a dark, almost olive gray. Deering machines were gray-green. The merged company experimented with various shades through the first 2 decades of the 20th century, looking for something that read as ownership, as loyalty, as identity. What they found, eventually, was red. But the red needed a machine worthy of it.
Before 1924, tractors were, in agricultural terms, a solution to only part of the problem. The big early machines, the Titans, the Moguls, the massive belt-driven engines that International Harvester had been selling since the early 1900s, could pull a plow. They could run a thresher. What they could not do was cultivate row crops. Row cultivation, moving down the rows of corn or cotton, working the soil between the plants without destroying them, still required a horse. A farmer with 100 acres of corn might own a tractor for plowing and still keep 4 horses for cultivation. This was not a solution. It was a compromise. The man who ended that compromise was Bert Benjamin,
an IH engineer working out of the company's experimental department in Chicago. Benjamin spent years developing a tractor with a narrow front end, high clearance, and an adjustable rear wheel spacing that would allow it to straddle a row of corn without damaging it. The machine he produced in 1924 was called the Farmall. The original Farmall, no letter suffix yet, just Farmall, was built at the Rock Island, Illinois plant and introduced to Texas cotton farmers for field testing. It could cultivate 2 rows simultaneously. It could pull a 2-bottom plow. It could run a belt-driven corn sheller. A farmer with a Farmall could, for the first time, eliminate the horse from his entire operation without sacrificing anything the horse had done. The reception was not cautious. Within 3 years of the Farmall's introduction, International Harvester had orders it could not fill. The Rock Island plant could not keep pace. The company began looking for additional manufacturing capacity. They found it in Fulton County, Illinois.
Canton, Illinois, in 1915, was already an industrial town in a way that small Midwestern cities often were, built around the extraction and processing of what the surrounding land produced. Primarily, in Canton's case, that meant coal. The Spoon River watershed, running south and west of town, sat atop coal seams that had been worked since before the Civil War. The International Harvester Company acquired what had been the Canton Malleable Iron Plant in 1915, initially to produce cast iron components for implements. But as Farmall demand outpaced Rock Island's capacity in the late 1920s, Canton was expanded and converted. By 1929, the Canton Works, occupying a campus of buildings along the Spoon River, employing over 2,000 workers at its pre-war peak, was producing complete Farmall tractors. What came off that line first was the Farmall Regular, the original design now refined and refined again, painted in the red that was becoming the brand's visual signature. But the machine that would define what Canton built, the machine that turned the Canton Works into a name known on every corn farm in Illinois, arrived in 1939. It was called the Farmall M. If there is a single tractor that represents the height of what International Harvester built and what farmers believed they were buying when they bought IH, it is the Farmall M. Production began at Canton in 1939. The M was a row crop tractor in the classic Farmall configuration: narrow tricycle front, high clearance, adjustable rear wheels, but it was larger and more capable than anything that had come before it under that name. Its C-113 4-cylinder engine, displacing 247.7 cubic inches, produced 36 drawbar horsepower and just over 33 belt horsepower in its original Nebraska tractor test configuration. Later versions of the engine, after IH bored it out to 264 cubic inches and produced the MD diesel variant, could pull figures into the low 40s. The M cost, at introduction, approximately $1,100. In the currency of 1939, that was a serious commitment, roughly equivalent to $23,000 today. Farmers bought them anyway. In fact, they bought them faster than any previous IH tractor had ever sold. Between 1939 and 1952, the year production of the original M series ended and the Super M arrived, International Harvester built approximately 285,000 Farmall M tractors across its American plants. A significant share of those, estimates vary, but former Canton plant workers have placed the figure in archival interviews at roughly a third of total production, through the mid-1940s, came off the Canton line. What did it feel like to run one? Harold Bray, a Fulton County farmer whose family had farmed west of Canton since the 1880s, described buying his first M in 1947 in an oral history recorded by the Fulton County Historical Society in 1991. He said, "It was the first tractor where I felt like the machine and I were working together. The horse, you worked with the horse. The old Titan, you managed it. The M, you just drove it, and it did what you needed." That quality, the sense of a machine that responded, that participated in the work rather than merely performing it, is what the Farmall red on the M communicated to every farmer who saw one working in a field. The red said, "This is a working machine on a working farm, run by someone who knows what they're doing." In the Corn Belt of the 1940s and 50s, Farmall Red was a statement of agricultural seriousness. The Canton Works during these years ran 3 shifts. At its wartime peak in 1943 and 1944, when the plant had converted a portion of its capacity to produce military components, including half-track vehicles, Canton employed close to 5,000 people. The city of Canton's population in 1950 was approximately 11,000. The International Harvester plant employed directly or indirectly roughly 1 in 4 working adults in Fulton County. The M gave way to the Super M in 1952, which gave way to the MTA with torque amplifier in 1954, which gave way to the 300 and 400 series as IH moved to a numerical model designation system in the mid-1950s.
The specific alphanumeric changed. The red did not. The red stayed exactly what it had always been, the most recognizable color on the Illinois prairie, the color that told you, from the far end of a section of land, which family farmed that ground and where their loyalty lived. What happened next, in the decade between 1958 and 1968, was the decision that every Canton worker, every IH dealer in the Corn Belt, and every farmer who had bought an M and then a 400 and then a 560 had watched building for years. And when it arrived exactly as they had feared it would. Not as a crisis, but as a slow mathematical certainty that no single decision could stop. Through the 1950s, International Harvester remained the dominant force in American agricultural equipment. The 300 and 400 series tractors sold well. The company's combine and planter lines were competitive. IH dealer networks in Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, and Nebraska were, in many counties, as deeply embedded in the local farm economy as the grain elevator or the implement supply. But something was changing in how American farms were structured, and therefore in what American farmers needed from their equipment. The average American farm in 1940 had been approximately 167 acres. By 1959, it was 390 acres. By 1969, it would reach 390 acres. The farms were getting larger, fast, driven by the economic logic that only size could provide the return on capital that mechanized agriculture required. A larger farm needed a larger tractor. International Harvester's answer to this demand was the Farmall 560, introduced in 1958. The 560 was a departure from the classic M configuration in significant ways: wider, heavier, more powerful at 60 drawbar horsepower, and it was manufactured at the Canton Works beginning in 1958, alongside the smaller 340 and 460 models. The 560 was also, in the brutal frank accounting of IH's own engineering records, a troubled machine from the start. The transmission that IH had designed for the 560, intended to handle the torque of the new high-compression engine, was undersized for the loads that farmers, accustomed to pushing an IH tractor hard, immediately put on it. Transmission failures in the field became a significant problem within the first 2 model years. IH eventually redesigned the transmission, but not before the 560's reputation in dealer showrooms had taken damage that would take years to repair. This mattered enormously in a market where reputation was everything. A farmer who bought an IH tractor in 1945 because his father had bought one in 1930 would buy another in 1960, unless something had broken his confidence. The 560's transmission problems broke confidence in ways that the red paint and the Farmall name could not fully repair. John Deere, meanwhile, had introduced the new generation tractors in 1960. The 3010 and 4010, unveiled at the Marshalltown, Iowa demonstration in August of that year, in what the company itself called the most important day in John Deere's history. The 4010 produced 84 horsepower from a 6-cylinder engine in a package that farmers immediately recognized as a generation ahead of what was sitting on competitor lots. The farm equipment market after 1960 was not the same market it had been before 1960. And International Harvester, for all its size and history and the power of its dealer network, was fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously, recovering from the 560's reputation problems and catching a competitor who had just moved the goalposts. There is a document in International Harvester's corporate archive, now held as part of the Case IH collection at the Wisconsin Historical Society in Madison. that shows the production figures for the Canton Works, year by year, from 1929 through 1984. The line climbs steadily through the 1940s and peaks in the early 1950s, holds through the late 1950s, and then begins a decline in the early 1960s that flattens but never recovers. The Canton plant that employed close to 5,000 people in 1943 employed approximately 1,800 by 1975. The total production figure at the end of that document, across every model, every series, every year Canton ran tractors, is 66,000 units from the Farmall line in the post-war period, alongside the components and implements that never made the census of famous machines, but kept the plant running between the headline models.
By 1980, International Harvester was a company in serious difficulty that had not yet fully understood how serious that difficulty was. The company's agricultural equipment division was profitable, though under pressure. Its truck division, which manufactured the Scout and the Transtar and a range of medium and heavy commercial vehicles, was enormous. And in 1979 and 1980, locked in a bitter and expensive strike with the United Auto Workers that lasted 172 days and cost IH an estimated $479 million in lost production. The company entered the 1980s carrying debt it had not planned for and revenue it had not received. Then the farm economy broke. Between 1981 and 1986, over 300,000 American farms were foreclosed. Farmland values, which had climbed steeply through the 1970s on the fuel of low interest rates and high commodity prices, collapsed. The Federal Reserve, under Paul Volcker, had raised interest rates to combat inflation. The prime rate peaked at 21.5% in June of 1981. Farmers who had borrowed against land value to buy equipment now could not service their debt. Equipment manufacturers watched their order books empty out in a single planting season. For IH, which needed revenue from both its truck division and its agricultural division to service the debt it had accumulated through the strike years, this was not a manageable setback. It was a structural crisis. In 1984, International Harvester sold its agricultural equipment division, the Farmall lines, the IH combine business, the planter lines, the red paint, the dealer network, the name rights, to Tenneco Inc., the Texas-based conglomerate that owned J.I. Case. The sale price was $488 million. The combined company would eventually operate as Case IH, painting its tractors in Case's Flambeau red rather than IH's Farmall red. The Farmall name was retired. The Canton Works was closed. The last tractor built at Canton was completed in the fall of 1984. Former plant workers who spoke to the Peoria Journal-Star in a retrospective piece published in 1994 said the line shut down without ceremony. Machines that had built machines were idled. Workers were given notice. The doors were locked. The final liquidation auction of Canton Works equipment ran over 3 days in early 1985. Machine tools that had produced components for Farmall tractors since the 1930s were sold at scrap prices to buyers from across the Midwest. A former Canton machinist who attended the auction told the Journal-Star, "I couldn't stay for the last day. I'd worked on some of those machines for 20 years. Watching them sell for what they brought, it wasn't something I needed to see twice." The auctioneer later told the paper he had conducted dozens of industrial liquidations across Illinois and Indiana. He said he had never worked a room that quiet. Canton, Illinois has a population today of approximately 13,700, roughly what it was in 1960, before the plant began its long contraction. But the composition of that population and the economic structure beneath it is not what it was in 1960. The International Harvester plant site along Sibley Avenue has been partially cleared, partially redeveloped, and partially left as the kind of vacant industrial ground that Midwestern manufacturing cities know too well. A portion of the original complex was converted to warehouse and light industrial use in the 1990s. Some buildings were demolished. The footprint of what was once the largest employer in Fulton County now produces no tractors, no components, no agricultural equipment of any kind. Fulton County's population has declined in each census since 1980. The county seat's largest private employer in 2024 is a state correctional facility.
the Western Illinois Correctional Center, opened in 1991
on land that had been farmland west of town. The economic logic that replaced a manufacturing plant with a prison is its own kind of American agricultural history, and it is not a story that any of the Canton workers who built Farmall tractors for 40 years were asked whether they wanted to live inside.
The IH dealer on the square in Canton is long gone. The dealership signs that once made the main streets of every small Illinois town a kind of agricultural flag display, IH red here, deer green there, Oliver's meadow green on the corner, have been replaced by the consolidated branding of Case IH and AGCO, companies that exist as the survivors of a consolidation that consumed most of the brands this audience grew up with. The Farmall red that once announced a Canton-built tractor moving across a field outside London Mills or Fairview or Ipava is still visible in Fulton County, but it's visible on machines that are 40 or 50 years old, maintained by people who learned to maintain them from someone who is no longer alive to ask questions of. Somewhere tonight, in a machine shed outside Lewistown, Illinois, a man in his mid-60s is doing something that his father would have called routine, and that the rest of the world has lost the vocabulary to describe. He is adjusting the carburetor on a 1952 Farmall M, the C-113 engine, the one before they bored it out, the one that Bert Benjamin's team had refined over 13 years of field feedback. And he is doing it by feel and sound, the way his father taught him, and the way his father's father had learned it when the tractor was new. The Red Power Roundup, held annually and drawing collectors from across the Midwest and beyond, is one of the largest antique tractor gatherings dedicated to international harvester equipment in North America. In recent years, attendance has exceeded 10,000 people. The machines on display range from the earliest Titan and Mogul engines of the 1910s to the final IH-branded tractors of 1984. The Farmall M is, at virtually every show, the most numerously represented model, because they built so many of them, and because they were built well enough that a significant number have survived decades of outdoor storage and sporadic maintenance and still run.
The people at these shows are not primarily hobbyists in the casual sense. Many of them are farmers or the children of farmers who grew up on these machines and who maintain them as a form of agricultural memory, a way of keeping the knowledge alive that the factory closed without transmitting to anyone. The specific sound of a well-tuned C-113 at operating temperature, the feel of the torque amplifier engaging on a 560 Super, the precise adjustment that makes the difference between a carburetor that runs clean in October cold and one that stumbles. This knowledge does not exist in a manual, in any archive. It exists in people. And the people who hold it are, like the machines themselves, getting older. If you are one of those people, if you have a Farmall M in your shed right now, or if your father's M is still sitting where he left it 20 years ago, or if you learn to drive on one and still remember the throttle response, this channel sees you. What you're doing matters. You are the archive.
The Farmall red did not disappear from the landscape of central Illinois by accident. It disappeared because the farms that ran red tractors were, many of them, absorbed into operations large enough that a 40-horsepower row crop machine could no longer do useful work. And the farms that survived, the ones that grew into the 1,000-acre and 2,000-acre operations that now dominate Fulton County's agricultural landscape, run equipment that costs more than the Canton Works sold for in 1984. They are not running Farmalls. The machine and the scale of farming it served went down together. The family-scale corn operation, the 200-acre farm in Fulton County, where a man and his son could put in a crop and take it off with an M and a combine and a pickup truck and know every acre of it by name, is not gone from the landscape entirely, but it is rare enough to be remarkable. The farms that replaced it are businesses in the fullest corporate sense of the world, and they need different tools. That is not a judgment. It is a description of what happened when interest rates peaked at 21% and land values fell 60% in 5 years, and equipment manufacturers found that half their customers had vanished, not by choice, but by foreclosure. The 1980s farm crisis did not just kill companies, it killed a structure of rural life that had been building since the Farmall regular came off the line in 1924. Cyrus McCormick built his reaper to free the farmer from the bottleneck of harvest. International Harvester built the Farmall to free him from the horse. What nobody built, what no machine and no company and no government program was able to provide, was a way to keep the farms at the scale that those machines were designed to serve. When the scale changed, the machines became antiques. When the farms disappeared, the factories followed.
The Canton Works ran for 69 years. It built somewhere north of 66,000 Farmall tractors in the post-war decades. It employed, at its peak, 5,000 people in a county of 40,000 souls. The buildings are mostly gone. The population is declining. The red paint remains, in sheds, at shows, in the hands of people who will not let the knowledge die, simply because the company did. That is the real story of what International Harvester built in Canton. Not the tractors, what the tractors made possible. A county full of farms that knew themselves and each other and the land they worked, and the color that meant they were serious about it.
If you grew up on a Farmall, or if your grandfather did, and you remember the particular smell of that C-113 warming up on a cold October morning, the next story we're telling is one you'll want to hear. It's about another color, another county, and another factory town that built machines the farming world has not forgotten, even if the company's name has nearly vanished from the landscape. The color was meadow green. The company was Oliver. And the story of what happened in Charles City, Iowa, is one of the stranger collapses in American agricultural history. That's the next one. Stay with us.